This is a short presentation, actually, on the nervous system diseases and injuries. We want you to know the terms for various types of injuries and general descriptor of diseases, as well as healing patterns. And that comes into play less than other tissues, because in the central nervous system, at least, there is minimum healing that can occur. So let's start with some types of brain injuries. There's a variety of causes of the damages. You can dispose or distort do some damage to tissue at an impact. So if you were a boxer and got a blow to the head and you were able, it was strong enough that the brain actually kind of squished against the cranium, you would have a injury there as a result. You can have increased intracranial pressure. What's happening here is an excess of cerebral spinal fluid, which is either not being reabsorbed or it is being produced faster than it can be reabsorbed. We have infections that can occur in the brain, and there is some free radical damage that occurs particularly after ischemia. So if there is an ischemic stroke that blocks off blood flow to the tissues, you can end up with additional damage from chemicals released by the damaged cells. Now, just some traumatic brain injuries, and understand what these are. This is a good type of test question where I say which is not a traumatic brain injury or something along that line. By definition, if you have a concussion, you have lost consciousness. And that doesn't have to be for very long. It can be for a matter of a few seconds to a few minutes. But the end result is that you are going to end up with a headache, some drowsiness, maybe confusion, inability to concentrate. And this can be a slight to somewhat more severe injury. Generally speaking, there is no permanent brain damage because the body can adapt. However, if you have repeated concussions, then you may in fact end up with some brain damage. Now, contusions. This is a bruising of the brain. You are unconscious, but you will have cerebral spinal fluid. You'll have blood in the cerebral spinal fluid, and that is a difference between a concussion and a contusion. A concussion will have no blood in the cerebral spinal fluid. A contusion will. You will have cell destruction with contusion, and since nervous tissue in the brain does not regenerate, what's going to happen is potentially a loss of function. The brain can rewire around some injuries, but still this can be fairly significant. Laceration is a tearing of the brain. And in that case, you could have a skull fracture or a bullet that comes into play. You're going to have increased intracranial pressure as a result of that because there's going to be bleeding. So again, you'll have bleeding in the cerebral spinal fluid. And the bleeding that we're talking about, hematoma, is just an area where bleeding has occurred, which is actually pressing on the tissue. And then we have cerebral edema, and this is swelling from an inflammatory response. It can compress and kill brain tissue, so you can have an immune response that can cause damage to the brain. Now, cerebrovascular accident, that's a stroke. It is the third leading cause of death after heart attacks and cancer. And there are really two types of stroke. One we mentioned already, which is ischemic. What has happened is that there's been blockage in the vessel, which results in decreased blood flow to those tissues. And then there is a hemorrhagic, where we have actually damage to the tissue and bleeding into it. So, yeah, with the odds generally favor an ischemic stroke, There is a slightly greater likelihood that that's going to occur. These are treated very differently. An ischemic stroke, what we want to do is to unblock the vessel. So one of the things, they can do something called TPA, and this will help unblock it. Unfortunately, if we have a hemorrhagic stroke, that same treatment can make things worse. So they will want to know the symptoms prior to the stroke or during the stroke, or they may want to get a CAT scan to see what's happening. There are several risk factors, the same ones that you always hear about. There's high blood pressure, high cholesterol, heart disease, diabetes, smoking, obesity, alcohol. So a variety of things that if you have them make you a little bit more likely to develop a stroke. I mentioned TPA, that's tissue plasminogen activator. If it is used within 3 hours of a stroke, of a ischemic stroke, then you can decrease the permanent disability. Now, a TIA, and I think of these as brain farts, basically. There, you start to do something, you draw a blank, you may have stroke-like symptoms, so you may have blurry vision, you may have dizziness, slurred speech, numbness, or paralysis, but it is short-lived. It reaches maximum intensity really quickly, persists for a few minutes, and then leaves no deficits. This is caused by an impaired blood flow. So this is a ischemia that is occurring within the tissues, but it is short-lived. We have lots of methods our body has for breaking down clots, and so we are able to take care of this, or our body takes care of this quite often. But if you're experiencing this, aspirin, taking aspirin early on is beneficial. There are other treatments. You can get on anticoagulants, which will stop you from developing these little incidental clots that block up parts of the brain. You may have to have artery bypass grafting if you've got a blockage that is occurring in like the carotid artery, and you may have a carotid endarterectomy, and that's where they actually go in and they will ream out blockages within the vessels. This does have its own risks associated with it, as in doing this, they may loosen something that could go to the brain. Now, epilepsy, and this is a very common neurological disorder. It affects about 1 in 100 people. You get short, recurrent attacks initiated by electrical discharges in the brain. And what will happen is an area will start firing erroneously. It will actually recruit other parts of the brain. Pretty soon you've got a major area of the brain that is firing inappropriately and leading to things like seeing lights or hearing noises or smells, which could be sensed. We get skeletal muscles in a grand mal seizure. These will contract involuntarily. You will lose consciousness. Now, there's lots of things that can lead to epilepsy. There could be brain damage at birth. There could be brain damage later on in life. You can have metabolic disturbances, which can lead to this. You can have infections. You can take toxins, get something, like DDT or some other environmental toxin. Drug interactions can cause this. One very common one, actually, is Wellbutrin, which is used as an anti-smoking drug. It's also used as a antidepressant. And combined with alcohol, this can lead to seizures. We've got vascular disturbances, head injuries, tumors that also can come into play. Now, aphasia. We talked about Broca's area before, but we've got an inability to comprehend words or an inability to speak, depending kind of where it is. Now, there's non-fluent aphasia where you aren't able to properly form words, but you may be able to hear and understand just fine. People know what they want to say, they just can't say it, or they may even think that they're saying it, but it doesn't come out right. And this is due to damage to Broca's area. There's also fluent aphasia, where they can't understand what you're saying. They can hear you, they can speak fine, but they don't understand what you're saying. So in this case, you might say something to the person and they would be, what? Just what? So there's a couple of versions of this, actually. There is word deafness, where you can't understand spoken words, but you may still be able to read. Or there's word blindness, where you're able to hear words, but you cannot read them. And some of this comes into play why we have certain shaped signs. You know, the stop sign is octagonal because even if you cannot read the word, you can recognize the color and you can recognize the shape. We can have damage to some of the integrative areas or auditory association areas that come into play with this. Alzheimer's disease or dementia, and Alzheimer's disease, not all dementia is Alzheimer's disease, so be aware of that. But dementia, you get loss of reasoning ability to read, write, talk, eat, walk. All of these can occur, but with varying severity of the symptoms. And it is something that can be intermittent. So someone can suddenly just kind of lose their ability to know where they are or what they're doing, but most of the time be fine. It just depends. But about 11% of the population over 65 have some degree of dementia. Well, we have a loss of certain neurons, those that release acetylcholine. We have plaques of abnormal proteins outside the neurons. And truthfully, to fully diagnose Alzheimer's disease, you have to do a biopsy of the brain after the person has died to see if there are plaques out there, something that you're not going to be able to fully diagnose actually until after death. And you get these protein filaments within the neurons which interfere with the function. Now, there are lots of risk factors. Head injury, well, I shouldn't say a lot of risk factors, but head injury and heredity come into play. If you have a grandfather or a family member who is a grandmother, if you've had a family member, you a grandfather, grandmother, something like that, that has developed dementia, there is a chance that you could as well. Now, interestingly, there are some beneficial effects to estrogen, so women are slightly less likely to develop Alzheimer's disease than men.